All right, welcome to the Pangburn Philosophy Podcast. This is Travis Pangburn. Today I am speaking with my hero, Richard Dawkins. He is an internationally best-selling author. Among his books are The Selfish Gene, The Blind Watchmaker, The God Delusion, The Greatest Show on Earth, The Magic of Reality, and many more. And it's just such a privilege to have Richard on today. Thanks for coming on, Richard.
Thank you for having me.
So what's new in the world of Richard Dawkins? What's been keeping you busy lately?
Well, I've just been finishing off a book called Outgrowing God, which is a kind of young person's version of the God Delusion, I suppose, although it doesn't cover the same chapters, but it is an anti-God book for young people.
Right, and how, I feel like we need more and more literature that gives this option to young people and to parents, for sure. How important is it that we have more literature like this?
I think it's very important. When you think of the sheer volume of literature, of religious literature that's out there for young people, I think it's very important to try to break the cycle of parent to child to grandchild, etc., where religion simply gets passed down from generation to generation, and people are brought up with it without really thinking about it for themselves. They just take on the religious beliefs of their parents and their schooling and all that kind of thing. So breaking the cycle, breaking that round and round cycle that goes on and all the time, I want to achieve that, and that's what I hope this book will do.
Right, and I think something that goes hand in hand with this, I think there also needs to be an intervention of skepticism being kind of the norm that we teach in schools, and kind of adding that curriculum to the school program. Is skepticism part of the cure to help these kids out of dogmatism?
I think it is, and I think that might be the next book.
Right.
But this one is about, the thinking of things like homeopathy and telepathy and water divining and things like that, and just a general skeptical attitude. I thoroughly approve of that, yes. And we must be careful not to kill the imagination. We don't want to say that we don't love stories and even fairy stories, as long as they're taken with a measure of skepticism.
Right, and I think as long as we're categorizing that as art, as opposed to in some way that the belief in fairies should be taken as a scientific proposition, I think if we...
nobody actually believes in fairies, but nevertheless, there is a need for a greater skeptical outlook, I think. And without destroying imagination, without destroying poetry and art, we do need to have a more skeptical attitude.
Right, I couldn't agree more. So on October 23rd in Chicago, you will speak with evolutionary theorist Bret Weinstein. So typically when you're speaking with another evolutionary scientist, what are some topics that you like to get into that you might not be able to with just a philosopher?
Oh, well, I think there's quite a lot we can talk about. The various, evolutionary science is in a very exciting phase at the moment with molecular genetics. It's become a branch of information technology, which certainly wasn't in Darwin's time. Darwin would have been, I think, both bewildered and thrilled by the way his own subject is taken off now. And so that's certainly a nice thing to talk about. That helps us to understand the pedigree of life. We can now have a sporting chance of actually reconstructing the entire family tree of life. And really the limit is just the time and money spent on sequencing DNA or sequencing proteins. So that's an exciting field. Paleontology is moving along fast. I'm not quite sure what Bret Weinstein wants to talk about, but I'll be interested to hear anyway.
I know a really interesting subject for him is the evolution of religiosity in human beings and whether it's a bug or a necessity. And I think this will be a really interesting topic for you guys to touch on. There may be some points of contention that you guys will be able to work through.
Yes, well, I've described it as religion as a virus of the mind. I don't know if that's what you meant by a bug.
Yeah.
But, yes.
Yeah. Okay, very cool. I think everyone's really looking forward to that. Bret's been making, a lot of interesting waves, and he's been providing some great education from an evolutionary standpoint. So I think he's a very important voice going forward. So it seems like the world is becoming more secular, at least through my eyes, and I feel like it's happening rapidly. Do you notice this?
The polls suggest that that's true, certainly in Western Europe and actually in America too. The polls are all moving in the right direction. I think it's something like more than 20% of Americans now describe themselves as having no religion, which is a great advance on the past. And I think it's going to carry on, especially because if you poll young people especially, you find that the figure is a lot higher.
Right. Yeah, I spent a lot of time with university and college types, and I mean, I cannot remember the last time, and I meet hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students, and just in those conversations, I can't remember the last time I came across anyone that's harboring any theistic belief systems. So it seems
well,
rare.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I'm rather distressed to see, even in Oxford, which should be a sort of elite university, there's the Christian Union is very, very active, and they seduce young people, young freshmen who are sort of lonely and need befriending, and no, they're a ruthless lot.
Right. Yeah, it's such a, it's such an attractive belief system in a few different ways to some people if they don't look at some of these passages as literal, but it's hard to get over that for people if you look at these religious systems from a skeptic's perspective, I think. So what I was going to ask you, outside of religion and God belief, are there some common myths scientifically that you come across regularly that you are constantly having to debunk or educate people on?
Well, within my own field of evolution, do you mean? I mean things like well, I'll believe in evolution when I see an ape turn into a human, that kind of thing. Right. There's plenty of that sort of stuff about it.
Yeah.
I saw only this week somebody told me about the Minister of Education in India, the Federal Minister of Education, actually said we must stop teaching evolution in schools because I've never seen an ape turn into a human. I mean, that sort of someone of that idiotic caliber is actually a Minister of Education in a leading country in the world.
Yeah, like how do they reconcile that? Do they just value what, like the educational value to what he has to offer is so high that when they hear stuff like that, they can just brush it off their shoulders?
Don't know. I mean, I have no idea how somebody of that low caliber could possibly have got that job. But anyway,
right.
So, I mean, I haven't looked into the case.
And is there still, should we look at value in say if we have a professor that even an evolutionary biologist professor that believes in religious fairy tales as being actually true, should we still look at where they can be valued from an educational standpoint, or should we want them to, can we even stomach having these people teach anymore?
Well, I suppose you have to make a distinction between sophisticated religious people who have no problem with evolution, obviously, and I mean bishops and archbishops and things have no problem with evolution. So I think it'd be very intolerant to say we can't stomach them. But I do think that we should look very carefully at anybody who's teaching, who actually teaches arrant nonsense, factual nonsense, like six-day creation, something like that.
Right. I mean, you've obviously spent a lot of time in your life thinking about how this process of life could have got going in the first place. Are we any closer to that answer, or do you have kind of your best educated guess based on the evidence that is available for that?
Well, that's a big open question. I mean, once evolution got started, once we have a proper genetics going, once DNA was there, then we pretty much understand the whole process. But the start of it, the very first gene, the very first, wouldn't have been DNA, the very first self-replicating molecule, which was necessary before natural selection could get started, that's still a big puzzle. And there are various theories. I think the vogue theory at the moment is the RNA world theory, which I think sounds pretty plausible to me, but there's no very positive evidence in favor of it.
Right. Yeah. It's just always an interesting question. It's a question everyone seems to want to know. Do you think we'll ever get closer to understanding that? I mean, will it come down to being able to replicate this process in the lab?
Well, because we don't know the conditions under which it happened, I think the best we can hope for is that somebody will come up with a model which is so beautiful and so elegant that we'll say, oh yes, it had to be like that. That's so elegantly clear that it must have been like that. And I think we're a long way from that at the moment.
Right. And you've always talked about the beauty of evolution and how it just creates this beautiful hierarchy of this family tree. And what do you think the hurdle is in people seeing the beauty in something like evolution, like coming from very simplistic beginnings into complicated life forms? Like, what's the hurdle there?
I think it's difficult for people to believe that such prodigious complexity could have come about by the unaided laws of physics, filtered through the sort of rather special process of natural selection. I mean, it is a big ask to accept that something as complicated as, well, just a fly or a bee or something, let alone a human. A bee is a little robot vehicle which buzzes about under the control of its sense organs. It's got wings that it can control. It can fly in all sorts of complicated ways. It is a big ask to say this is a robot vehicle which has been put together under the laws of physics by this process called natural selection. I do sympathize with people who find it hard to believe. The alternative is no easier to believe, of course.
Right. Yeah, it definitely does take a level of understanding the evidence too, and this always seems to be a problem because it's not necessarily an easy concept to grasp. It's
and I think that's probably the explanation for why it took so long. I've always been a bit curious in a way why it took until the middle of the 19th century for anybody to get it. In 2 centuries later than Newton, and what Newton did would seem on the face of it far cleverer, far more difficult to grasp it. It had to wait until the 19th century, and then it was grasped at least twice independently, Darwin and Wallace and possibly others. And I think possibly historically the reason why it took so long was that it would have seemed to people so obvious that there had to be a divine designer. There couldn't be any other explanation. And yet they were wrong. It took an act of, I think, real courage for Darwin to say, no, let's just look and see whether there is a non-intelligent, a non-creator explanation for this. And once he thought of it, it's spectacularly simple. It's so simple that you wonder why nobody thought of it before. But as I say, I think the reason they never thought of it before was that it somehow seemed obvious there couldn't possibly be any explanation other than a divine creator.
Right. One thing I wanted to chat about is there is this problem of genital mutilation around the world. A lot of this, basically all of it, as far as I can see in human history, is tied to religious belief systems. And it's very easy to point at female genital mutilation in the West, and obviously this should be stopped, and we need to go after the people who are doing this. But what do you think about the prevalence of male genital mutilation or male cutting in Western culture?
A little bit odd, isn't it, that God is supposed to have made us in his own image, and the first thing he asks us to do is chop a bit of it off.
Yeah.
It's just a slightly strange anomaly. I think it's important not to equate the two. Female genital mutilation is a deliberate effort to spoil sexual pleasure. And I don't think that's what male circumcision is about. I'm not quite sure what it is about, but it's not in the same class, and I prefer not to lump them together. I mean, I've noticed that whenever anybody puts on Twitter, for example, a condemnation of FGM, it immediately unleashes a great torrent of what about male genital mutilation.
Right.
And that's fair enough, but I don't think they should be equated.
Yeah, I think equating it is a mistake. I think it's just obvious that the detriments for female genital mutilation are just so much grander and greater on a much larger scale.
And they're deliberately setting out to spoil sexual pleasure for a lifetime.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I know some Jewish scholars talk about the reason why the male genital mutilation craze started was, I mean, in fact, they did want to basically numb the organ to a sense and try to stop this mass amount of masturbation that was happening in sex in their culture. I know that was, but. Yes. I mean, it's
that was the motivation of Kellogg. You know, Kellogg, the cornflakes man.
Yes.
He was fanatical about circumcision for exactly that reason. He thought he'd trying to stop masturbation.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, you can't destroy all the lubricants in the world. I find it interesting that we still are doing this to infants, and as far as I can tell, I've read all the literature on it, and it seems like this is something we're doing to infants for 100% almost non-medically necessary reasons. So I just find it to be interesting that we're kind of still carrying this out in the West. I think it's something that we're overlooking, and that if we actually took time to look at it, we would say, oh, why the hell are we doing this?
Yes, I mean, I gather it's very prevalent in the United States and nothing to do with religion, but it just sort of is a custom.
Yeah.
And it was in Britain until quite recently as well. I mean, not 100%, maybe about 50%. I mean, I went to boarding schools, and so I'm sort of got a fairly good statistical sample. It's about 50% in Britain. And not correlated with religion or anything else, as far as I could tell. Just hard to know what it's correlated with.
Right, and I think as far as I can tell, the people who have really studied this, it's about 30% of the males on this planet are cut at birth, and 70% are not. So I think it's actually the numbers are going down because I think we've seen that other cultures get along just fine without doing this to infants.
Is that true in the United States, do you know?
I think the United States is actually closer to 50-50 or even 60-40. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
okay.
and then most in most Asian countries, it hardly is never done. So.
Yes.
Yeah. So here's a question: what do you think the greatest ideological threat to humanity is these days in these current modern times?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Let me think. I mean, militant Islam is obviously up there.
Right.
Not just the greatest, but that comes to an ideological threat, I suppose. Mm-hmm. Maybe Catholic opposition to condoms is another one.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's clearly ideological.
Mm-hmm. One thing I go to often when I think about this question is just anti-science, anti-scientific thinking.
Yes, and that does have a sort of ideological dimension to it, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I try to spend my life eradicating anti-science in any way that I can, and these anti-scientific beliefs are just so damaging, I think, to human progress, and I think damaging human progress that could potentially get us to a level where we become more sustainable as a species is
Yes, I mean, do you see that in intellectual circles, in university circles, for example?
Well, I don't. I'm seeing it much less. it seems like there's been this explosion of intellectualism and this explosion of not wanting to be the one holding the indefensible position from a scientific perspective. So I think that movement, like, it's becoming popular to think, as far as I can tell. Even in the past 5 years, there's been this explosion with with these large-scale live events I've been doing with scientists and intellectuals. We just broke the record for 8,500 people coming out to hear two intellectuals speak on a large arena stage. So I think we're at this new level of the need for intellectual discourse and the want to be included in that. So I think we're getting to a pretty good area.
Is there a sort of academic movement that says something like science is only one kind of ideology and science is just a tool for patriarchal oppression and that kind of thing? Have you come across that?
Yeah, I see it coming from the extreme left, and I see if there are undesirable scientific findings that are verifiably true, rather than taking the reasoned approach to those truths, these truths want to be kind of stricken from the record.
Yes, I have come across that too.
If there's an undesirable truth, say one thing that really gets people up in arms is these studies that have been done trying to see if there's anything, if there's IQ differences generally from between races. And I know that really gets people up in arms, and if there happens to be findings, and I don't know if there is anything compelling there, that say a black person, because they happen to be black, generally will have a lower IQ than a white person. If this finding happened to be true, scientifically based on some kind of model, then the knee-jerk reaction would be to hide that finding and throw it away, as opposed to dealing with the truth of that.
Yes, it mustn't be allowed to be true.
Right.
But I think what we should be saying is something like, if there was a statistical tendency in that direction, it should have absolutely no impact whatsoever on our political decisions and our decisions on how to hire people, anything like that. But to say that it mustn't be allowed to be true,
yes,
that you falsify the science, be going too far.
Yeah, I think that's a dangerous thing to do, because all of a sudden we might find a piece of evidence about human evolution down in the future that people might find undesirable and want to strike it from the record.
Yes.
Yeah. How important is it? So at Pangburn Philosophy, we started translating all of our live event discussion content into Arabic. And we're going to be doing this in different languages as well. And we actually just released our first video, and it's actually really got a lot of legs in the Arabic-speaking community. So there seems to be a hunger to spread intellectual discourse in Arabic-speaking countries. Obviously, I don't know what the figure is now, but how many times has the God Delusion been downloaded in? I think it was even in the Arabic language. What's that?
Yes, 13 million is
Wow.
the figure that I heard. And we've started a new project. CFI has started a new project to translate several of my books into not just Arabic, but Urdu and Indonesian and other languages of Islamic countries. And that's going ahead well. We've got a couple of benefactors who are helping with that. And so we're very, very pleased about that. Are you doing your YouTube videos into Arabic, did you say?
Yes, yeah. So we all of our free content that ends up on YouTube,
Is that subtitles or dubbed or what?
Yes, it's we're doing it with subtitles for now. We did look at doing the language, the dubbing itself, and I guess the polls, when we looked at some polls on what people prefer in these other countries, they preferred the subtitles. So that's kind of.
I should hope. I hate the idea of dubbing. Do it with subtitles.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's better. It's I always find it weird to even watch a Hollywood film when it's been dubbed with a different language. It just seems strange.
I feel very strongly about this because I'm actually trying to learn both French and German,
Right.
and I would love to do it by watching films and just watching newsreels and things. And it's maddening when you get about 2 words of the language you're trying to learn, and then they fade it out, and you get the voice of an interpreter instead, and that infuriates me.
Right. So I wanted to ask you, as a point of interest for me, what are some other scientific fields that you like keeping an eye on? Like what interests you most outside of biology?
Oh, well, computer science and astronomy, cosmology, planetary science. I mean, I'm looking forward to my conversation with Carolyn Porco, for example.
Oh,
I
yes.
had one with you and a couple with my own foundation. Looking forward to that very much. I'm utterly fascinated by that, and I hope to learn a lot. And as I say, computer science as well.
Yeah, and that'll be on October 22nd for everyone listening in Calgary, Alberta. This will be our first large event in Calgary, and we are almost sold out for that event. So please get your tickets so you can come down and see Richard and Carolyn have a conversation. And then we'll also be with Richard on November 1st at the beautiful Beacon Theater in New York City with Brian Greene. Richard, are you familiar with Brian?
Of course I am, yes.
Yeah.
In fact, I've had a conversation with him on stage before.
Right. And what do you think of his theoretical approach to physics and just as a mathematician? He's quite a bright man, isn't he?
Of course he is. You're asking me to speak about Brian Greene's physics. Of course I can't do that. But I hope to learn something again, as I say.
Yeah. Why don't we talk about... Are you of the camp that's worried about the level that artificial intelligence could reach to, and if so, do you think it's ever going to get outside of our control?
People I respect are very worried about it. People like Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking. I think it very easily could get out of our control. I'm not one of those who thinks you can just pull the plug out. You can't do that. Yeah. I'm genuinely curious to know how far it can go. I mean, as a naturalist, I am committed to the view that anything the human brain can do can, in principle, be done in silico with software. So I think it can be done. Forecasts of the imminent takeover by artificial intelligence have fallen a bit short. So it's being a bit slower than people one time feared or hoped. On the whole, I'm an optimist. I mean, I'm so curious about what can be done. And I can't help a sort of niggling feeling that possibly they might do a better job of it than we're doing.
Yeah, I guess it depends on their relationship, what their relationship will be to their pleasure drive, I think. Because it seems like we're just at the mercy of our pleasure drive, and we just, we're the last to know what we're doing in a sense, and we're just... reacting to our environment. Is that going to be the key to figure out like what's going to be the driving force behind AI? Well,
in principle, we can program into them whatever pleasure drive we want to, I suppose.
Right.
No, I'm actually curious. I like science fiction too, and I'm curious to see in a science fiction-y kind of way what may happen. But it may take rather longer than we think. It may be that I'll be dead before anything very much more happens.
Yeah, it is. It's hard to tell. It seems like when we do start making really big steps towards the final conclusion or answer, things start happening rapidly. So maybe tomorrow we will be enslaved by robots.
Maybe. As I say, it might not be too bad a thing.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today, Richard.
I didn't go quite just yet. I just wanted to mention, when I was talking about my book for young people, there's another book working on for even younger people, for young children. Again, not quite sure what that might be called, but it might be called OMG, I Think I'm an Atheist.
Yes.
And that's for children of about sort of 10 or so, which is a quite separate book from Outgrowing God, which is kind of aimed at teenagers. And that's going to be a picture book.
That's
and
great.
I'm still looking for a publisher for that. So if any publisher is listening in who wants to publish a beautifully illustrated picture book on atheism for children, then I'd like to hear from them.
Well, I want to put my name at the top of the list. I would love to publish it. But we can talk about that more.
Please, yes.
Yes, I'm so passionate about your work, Richard, and I think these books for children are so important, especially for the parents who want to have some literature that their children are going to be interested in that don't have to do with some kind of religious dogma or with religious undertones of some kind. So I think this is just so important.
Are you a publisher, in fact?
Well, we're starting actually to publish works for young skeptic writers, and so we're kind of in the very early stages of this, but we are, we're going to be publishing Armin Navabi's next book, and we also are going to be publishing my first book here soon, basically about pleasure and the role that it plays in our lives, and how do we, basically the what I'm getting at in the book is trying to combat things like pedophilia, and how do we get ahead of pedophilia in the mind so that it doesn't manifest itself in reality. So
right, good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on today, Richard. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in Chicago and in Calgary and in New York. I think we're going to have some great events, and they're selling really well, so there's going to be lots of people there.
I look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. Everyone, This has been the Pangburn Philosophy Podcast. Let art and science inspire.